Welcome to Nolan Knows. It's time for the Story of the Week. The Story of the Week this week is the Supreme Court's decision in King v. Burwell. What the Supreme Court has decided is that the federal government can continue to supply subsidies to recipients of Obamacare even if they purchase their health insurance from a state exchange. Initially, the law seemed to imply that if you bought your health insurance at the federal exchange, you wouldn't get a subsidy. And now they've decided that you will. The end of the day, what this means is that Obamacare continues unabated, and there isn't very much that anybody can do at the Supreme Court level. Congress, your legislators, they may be able to change it, but I don't think they will. There were actually Republicans who were happy that this decision came down the way it did. Because if, in fact, the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of King and the subsidies ended, the Republicans would have been forced to come up with a solution. They would have had the politically uncomfortable position of saying, yeah, we're going to just continue these subsidies for a couple of more years till we can figure a way out of it. Or perhaps at the state level, pressure would have been applied for states to start building their own exchanges. So they were happy they didn't have to answer the question, that they didn't have to come up with a solution. It's kind of sad. It seems as though it was practically all of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, against the free market. In this segment of the program, I'm going to tell you what I think is wrong with the Supreme Court's decision on King v. Burwell, or Obamacare. When the law was written, Obamacare, that is, the Affordable Care Act, Jonathan Gruber, basically the architect of the law, saw to it that they put in the law incentives for the states to build their own exchanges. They didn't want the federal government to try to come up with an exchange for all 50 states. And so, as Mr. Gruber suggests, they wrote this law so that if you were in a state where they didn't build an exchange, you wouldn't get a subsidy from the federal government. That was the whole point of writing that law the way they did. What the Supreme Court did in its decision today is tell us that it doesn't matter. In fact, the Chief Justice suggested that there was some ambiguity in the line. But there was none. It was clear, and Gruber makes it clear. He talked about the ignorance of American voters, and he talked about why they wrote this law and how they wrote it so that the states would build their own exchanges. And what the Chief Justice did, and the majority did, is they simply rewrote the law. They ignored Congress. They ignored the law. Instead of saying, this is it, you don't get it, you don't get a check. If you want to fix it, it's up to Congress to fix it. No, instead what they said was, in the aggregate, what the law was supposed to do was subsidize the cost of health care. So in spite of this one sentence that limits the exchanges to state-run exchanges, we're going to ignore it completely and see to it that you get a check anyway. Some people call it an activist court. Some people say it's not. I think it is. I think the court should have ruled on the law as it was written, and if it needed fixed, they should have sent it back to Congress to fix it. While we're further exploring the King v. Burwell decision by the Supreme Court, we're now going to talk about young people. Yeah, I know it seems kind of a silly name, young people, for a segment. But the truth is, we are beating young people to death financially. We have been for decades. We've done it with Social Security. We make people who are working give up 13% of their pay so that they can support people who are retired. And when the people who are getting ready to retire are questioned about privatizing Social Security, they say, oh no, we've paid into it all our lives, we're entitled. So their solution is essentially to hold up the next generation. Social Security is like walking through the grocery store parking lot and somebody puts a gun to your back and says, give me your money. And after you do that, instead of calling the police, you put your gun to the next person's back and say, give me your money. Well, in addition to having stolen the money from our youth, we are now stealing the advantages of youth from our youth. We're telling them that at the prime of their lives, when they're their healthiest, when they're their least likely to need health care, we're going to make them pay more for their health care so they can subsidize old farts like me. Well, I don't think it's fair to young people. I think we ought to let them off the hook. I think the Republicans ought to get some testicular fortitude and start standing on principle and stop these people from ripping off young people. The court today essentially codified stealing youth from America's young.